I'm gonna be honest here, full transparency, I did not know that China is actually the world's biggest game developer. Yeah, I'm actually not kidding, that became a thing in 2021, 4 years ago, when they surpassed the United States at 46 billion US dollars, compared to $40 billion from the US in 2021. Now, fast forward just 2 years to 2023, and that number for China, like, doubled. Yeah, it jumped up to 82 billion US dollars, and for the US it did increase to 68 billion, but obviously that is not by as much as China. Clearly China is doing something incredibly right here in terms of just sheer numbers from game development. Now, like I said, I did not know that, but the reason I do now know that is because the game journalist website Automaton just came out with an article kind of on this, where it's actually looking at Japanese developers and specifically what their thoughts are on China's growing game development industry. Yeah, this is kind of interesting because, funny enough, yesterday's video I was talking about Nintendo and how they are very clearly, obviously, a huge developer, and how China, they have a lot of customers of Nintendo products. And it's funny because, you know, during that video, I really wouldn't have thought of China as a huge game developer, but yeah, they are the biggest in the world. Now, according to this website, they are interviewing a lot of different Japanese devs, including people who have experience working in both China and Japan as a game developer. And what's interesting is that the general consensus is that Japan, they focus a ton more on having a tighter budget, even if the revenue on their games is insane. So like Final Fantasy, for example, can be extremely successful, or a Persona game or a Mario game. It can have just a ton of revenue, but for Japan, for some reason, they would continue just to make the game budget tighter as they go forward with new games. They're not going to really throw more money into it. And this is the exact opposite in China. They invest a ton in these games. And I'm not talking a little bit either. Like, I'm not saying, you know, Japan spends an average of 10 million on a game and for China it's 15 million. No, I am saying that one person actually alleges that China spends like 10x the amount on games compared to Japan, and that's also including the manpower in these games. Like the actual number of physical people that are working on this game, it's a ton more in China, and because of that, apparently they get a lot of really polished games. So that was kind of the other big thing that was talked about in this article. Yeah, a lot of Japanese devs are seeing that these games from China look incredibly polished, at least in terms of the animation. It looks like there was just a lot of work that was poured into it. And they use a big example of an upcoming game that is called Arknight's Endfield. That is coming from a company that looks like they're called Hypergriff. They are from Shanghai, China. This is what's called a gacha game, which is kind of big right now in the mobile game industry. I don't know much about them, but I believe they're more of like live service games that kind of encourage microtransactions. And there's a video that went viral a few days ago on Twitter or X about this game. Specifically, it's really just a video of one of the character models kind of showing like the move set, and people are talking about how it just looks incredibly polished compared to a Japanese game. And to this point on animation, a lot of Japanese devs are also saying that there is apparently an animator shortage in Japan. There's a huge shortage of people who just focus their skills on animation. I'm kind of surprised to hear that, since Japan is very good with animation, whether it be in games or shows or movies. So, I mean, overall, it's kind of interesting because I really didn't think that Japan needed any help with their game industry. I guess I kind of thought like Japan is probably the biggest growing game industry right now, even though they have already been kind of at the top for decades now. I think they are just continuing to expand their global market and gain interest outside of Japan. I know that, like, you know, the Persona games, for example, are huge now, or at least they have much more of a Western audience than they once did. We're seeing that happen with those games and Final Fantasy and a lot of other Japanese games. What I'm getting at is that I didn't really think Japan was struggling much with their game industry. And maybe as a whole, maybe they're not. I mean, maybe it is still growing. But according to a lot of Japanese devs, when comparing themselves to China, they have apparently got a lot to learn. It looks like Japan needs a lot more animators, plus they need more big investment groups like Tencent or NetEase investing in them. And bottom line, it just seems that they need to put more money into these game projects and more manpower. I don't know what has got to happen overall to actually put that into motion, but now with China being at the absolute top of the game development industry, I would assume they're probably going to turn quite a bit of heads, so maybe a lot of other people in the US, the UK, and Japan, and maybe other countries are going to follow what they are doing.